Dominum, quia benignus
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And as you can hear from the introduction, actually, I don't have a formal background in architecture. Well, I know a little bit about computer architecture, but not. I don't have formal background in architecture. But I have great interest in sacred architecture, especially after being in various locations and seeing the variety of church architectures, and also the contrast between more traditional architecture versus what's built kind of more recently. So here I'm going to try to kind of share with you some of what I've learned. And so for this talk, I draw my materials from a number of sources. Actually, I have some of them here. So the first one is Pope Benedict's book on the spirit of the liturgy. It's very relevant to this conference, actually, and I highly recommend if you haven't to read it. And in this book, he talks about kind of also the architectural principles from the perspective of the liturgy. So that's Pope Benedict's book, and there's another book the second book is by an actual architect, Duncan Stroik. So the church building as a sacred place, beauty, transcendence, and the eternal. And Duncan Stroik's also a professor of architecture at Notre Dame University. And he actually built churches, and you can see some of the examples of his churches in his book, and also I'll show that also in this kind of lecture. Another book is The Catholic Church Architecture and the Spirit of the Liturgy, and this is by Dennis McNamara. So Dennis McNamara is he describes himself as an architectural historian. So he's not actually an architect, but he has great interest in terms of the history of architecture, focusing on especially American church architecture. And in this book, he kind of focuses on the actual church architecture in relation with the spirit of the liturgy. So another kind of highly recommended book for you to pick up. And the last one has a kind of provocative title, Ugly as Sin. And this is by this book is by Michael Rose, and it's quite an entertaining book to read because he describes what he thinks is going wrong with the kind of, especially in the modern era, how church architecture kind of stray from the traditional principles. And Michael Rose is. I would say he has education in architecture, but I don't think he's an architect, but more of a critic of architecture. So also another book that you might want to check out. So I don't have it here with me because I have it on my kind of Kindle. So with that, just for this talk, I'm going to kind of divide it into like 3 parts. So the first part, I'm going to describe kind of general principles underlying kind of the Christian place of worship, the church building. And then we're going to see some discussion on actual architectural objects that kind of are present in a Christian place of worship. And then in the last part, I'm going to discuss what happened in our kind of in the more recent times, the modern era. So with that, let's start with the first part. And why am I showing this? So this is from Genesis 28, verse 17. So this is terribilis est locus iste, hic domus Dei est et porta caeli. So this is, the translation is, literal translation, how terrible is this place? That's kind of looking at it kind of from a like fear point of view, but you can also kind of translate it as like how awesome is this place? For this is the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So this is Jacob's words after he had a dream at Bethel where he saw a vision of angels ascending and descending a ladder toward heaven, and also where God gave him this description of his future, of the future of his descendants, the people of Israel. And after he woke up from his dream, he said these words. And this is actually also the word that the church chooses as the introit chant, the entrance chant for the Mass of the dedication of a church. Also for the Mass of the anniversary of the dedication of a church. And I think the church chooses this particular phrase because the church wants us to feel this way when we are actually in a church, when we are actually in a Christian place of worship, that we are indeed, how awesome it is to be there, because it's indeed kind of the house of God, it's indeed the gate of heaven. So that's kind of what we should feel when we are in a church, that we are indeed in the house of God and in the gate of heaven. So that's kind of the essential character, the essential description of what the church is: house of God, gate of heaven, and everything kind of flows outward from kind of that reality. And now let's consider what should a house of God, what kind of characteristics should a house of God, should a gate heaven have? And actually, the title of Duncan Stroike's book, kind of, especially the subtitle, I think kind of describes it perfectly. What the house of God, gate of heaven should have, which is basically beauty, transcendence, and the eternal. So let's go one by one. So beauty. So what's beauty? It's usually when something is beautiful, but it's kind of might be hard to describe why something is beautiful. And I found a description by Dennis McNamara to be very revealing. And he says, something is beautiful when it clearly and fully reveals its ontological reality. So basically, it's beautiful when something clearly and fully reveals the reality of its being. So basically, a church then is beautiful given the reality of its being as a house of God and the gate of heaven. So the church is beautiful when it clearly and fully reveals its nature as a house of God and the gate of heaven. So that's beauty. And there's the part of the transcendence. Transcendence means that it should kind of bring us, not literally, but at least kind of conveys us to ponder, I would say, divine realities, heavenly realities. So brings us out of our earthly life and then make us kind of feel the divine presence. So that's kind of the transcendence part of what a church should be. And of course, there's the eternal. The eternal is timeless, something that's timeless. I think and it's proper for a house of God and a gate of heaven to be eternal, to be without end, because this is something divine. It's not something kind of, something artificial. It's something divine. So that's one perspective perspective of what essential characteristics a church should have. And another one's given by Michael Rose, the author of the fourth book. And he proposes what he calls natural laws for Catholic Church architecture. So these natural laws are verticality, permanence, and iconography. And we can connect each of these also to the characteristics presented before. So verticality, he claims, and I think I agree with him, that kind of traditionally, the traditional way of designing Catholic Church is kind of to emphasize the vertical. So you have more vertical than horizontal. And by this, kind of brings our eyes upward and upward toward heaven. And that's kind of related to the transcendence nature of a church mentioned before. So that's verticality. And then there's also permanence, which is directly related to the eternal. So a church, traditional church architecture is built such that you'll feel that it's going to last there forever. So it's not kind of something that's very easy to tear down. So again, connected to the idea of the eternal. And he also proposes that iconography kind of also is natural to be as an integral part of the Catholic Church. So iconography, so that this is the presence of sacred objects, sacred statues, images, and so on. And this is kind of, it's not kind of a quite direct relationship to, let's say, beauty discussed before, but I think the iconography kind of helps brings out the true nature of the church as a house of God and a gate of heaven. So that you can kind of connect that way to the idea of the beauty that a church building should have. So these are Michael Rossi's kind of natural laws of church architecture. So that, I've described so far kind of the characteristics. And if you actually also see the kind of design of traditional church, the architecture of a traditional church, you can actually trace it back to the time of, actually you can connect it to the Jewish place of worship, and actually you can trace it back all the way to the Old Testament, the time of the temple of Solomon, let's say. So this is actually something highlighted by Pope Benedict XVI in his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy. So that there's kind of this continuity all the way from the Old Testament, from the time of the Old Testament up to at least the kind of the recent present in terms of the traditional architecture for a Catholic Church. And this is kind of, especially can be seen in the fact that there are, for these places of worship, the Christian and the Jewish, there's a focal point. So let's start with the Temple of Solomon. In the Temple of Solomon, the focal point is the Holy of Holies here. So that's when the original temple was built, that's where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. So the Ark of the Covenant was considered as the sign of the presence of God on earth, and that's why it's kind of very holy. So this is the holiest place in the Jewish religion. And of course, during the exile, the original temple was destroyed, and then the Ark of the Covenant was lost. And then after a number of years, the Jewish people came back from the exile, came back to Israel from the exile. They rebuilt the temple, but there was no longer Ark of the Covenant. So, and actually they kept the Holy of Holies empty because the emptiness is kind of like a sign of like their expectation toward the coming again of God. So that's kind of the idea for the Temple of Solomon. So that goes all the way until it was destroyed just right after the time of Jesus. And then, when it was destroyed, the Jewish people kind of dispersed all over the world, and they built synagogues as their places of worship. And the focal point in the synagogue now is not quite the Holy of Holies, but is actually the the place where the Torah scrolls are kept. So it's marked here. So that's kind of a focal point in the synagogue is where the Torah scrolls are kept, because the Torah scrolls holds great significance for the Jewish people, because they consider it as something that came directly from God. So that's the synagogue, and I would argue that for us Christians, Catholics, the focal point in the church is the sanctuary. So that's where the altar is, and in most cases also where the tabernacle is. So the sanctuary here. And that's where we have our Mass, that's where the sacrifice of the Mass, where we focus on during the sacrifice of the Mass. And well, talking about the sacrifice of the Mass, well, that's kind of one fundamental difference between the Jewish and the Christians, because for us Christians, we have this Eucharistic sacrifice. The Jewish people, well, they don't have that. And there's also a fundamental difference in the sense that now we focus, so the Jewish people like to focus on the Torah, but we don't have a need for that anymore, because Jesus kind of supplanted that with his gospel. So we don't kind of focus toward where the Torah scrolls are kept anymore, but we focus on the altar where actually Jesus made his sacrifice each time during the Mass. He kind of the sacrifice of Jesus is being brought back to the present. So that's kind of that becomes our focal point for us Christians. And then another fundamental difference is in terms of orientation. So the synagogues are built so that when the Jews pray, they can orient themselves toward Jerusalem. So basically, they want to orient themselves toward where the temple used to be, because that's kind of where they believe where God kind of was present in kind of the old times. So for us Christians, we don't have this kind of orientation toward Jerusalem anymore. And traditionally, we have this eastward orientation, brought up by Francesco in his talk before. So the east kind of east because it's the direction toward the rising sun. And the rising sun is considered as kind of a symbol. So we don't worship the sun, really, but we consider it as a symbol of the presence of God in the universe. So that's kind of our, now we have, like traditionally at least for Christians, we have this eastward orientation. And does anybody know the orientation for the original Temple of Solomon? Yes, it's also east. So the eastward orientation, as it goes back all the way to the time of the Old Testament. So that's something that needs to be kind of kept in mind, I think, when especially considering how to design a church. So that's kind of, that's the first part of the talk. So now I'm going to go into some of the specific, the common elements that are present in the typical Catholic Church: the altar, tabernacle, sanctuary, and then the nave, the iconography, and the exterior. So let's start with the altar. So I would argue that in the Catholic Church there are two very important objects that are present there, and one is the altar. So altar is the place of sacrifice. So it's basically the place where Jesus' own sacrifice of the cross, again, was brought to the present time each time when we have the Mass. And the altar is also where we have the transubstantiation of the bread and wine into Jesus' own body and blood. So basically, this is where kind of God comes to earth. You can consider it that way. That's why the altar is very important. This is and because of its importance, traditionally, people have tried to highlight the altar's importance through several means. So one way is to basically putting the altar up above some steps. So its height kind of gives significance to its importance. And so that's one way. And another way is to design what's called the high altar. So this is an altar with various decorations, statues, and maybe paintings and so on. And if you see throughout history, there's also different ways to do it, but kind of sharing the same idea of creating this high altar, high main altar. And then another way is to basically put a tent or a canopy on top of the altar. And you can see this in the altar. This is the main altar of St. Peter's Basilica. You have this grand canopy, grand baldacchino. And you can actually, if you go back to the church, St. Stephen, you see the original main altar. You see the canopy there. So it kind of highlights that's important. And this kind of, using a canopy, you can trace it back also to the time of the Old Testament, where the Ark of the Covenant, when the Jews were still wandering, they put the Ark of the Covenant up under a tent, up under a canopy. And so that idea still kind of, we still kind of have, we see the implementation of our idea in our Christian times for our altar. And traditionally, you have altars made of stone, and also traditionally contains a relic of saints. And this idea, putting a relic of saints inside the altar, kind of goes back to the time of the early Christians, where you have where they say mass on top of tombs of the martyrs. And actually, if you consider some of the churches in Rome, I want to highlight first St. Peter's Basilica. The main altar is actually on top of the tomb of St. Peter. And another major basilica, the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, the main altar is on top of the tomb of St. Paul. So that's kind of, you see that kind of idea being present from the beginning, basically, from the beginning of Christianity. So yeah, when we talk about the altar, then we need to discuss also this debate, this issue of liturgical orientation. And yeah, if you go to a typical, like an average Catholic church these days, you see that the Mass is typically celebrated what's called versus populum. So the celebrant, the priest, facing the people, especially during the Eucharistic prayer. And this kind of practice, so the proponents of this practice claim that kind of this resembles what happened during the Last Supper. So Jesus was facing his apostles during the Last Supper. But actually, this is a claim that kind of dismissed by Pope Benedict XVI, and he quoted some words by Father Louis Bouyer. So Father Louis Bouyer was a 20th century, I would say, liturgical scholar. So he did a lot on research of the history of the liturgy, including also architectural history. And I would read some of Father Louis Bouyer's words here. So the idea that a celebration facing the people must have been the primitive one, and that especially of the Last Supper, has no other foundation than a mistaken view of what a meal could be in antiquity, Christian or not. In no meal of the early Christian era did the president of the banqueting assembly ever face the other participants. They were all sitting or reclining on the convex side of a C-shaped table or of a table having approximately the shape of a horseshoe. Nowhere in Christian antiquity could have arisen the idea of having to face the people to preside at a meal. So this idea of, facing the priest facing the people, because this is like Jesus facing his apostles. It's more of, I would say, a modern innovation than something from tradition. So what's traditional, again, is, as mentioned before, is this orientation towards the east, this Art Orientem. And as I've shown before, it goes back all the way to the time of even the Temple of Solomon. And I've heard some people claim that, in the old Mass, in the old times, the priest turns his back toward the people, and that's why it's not good for the priest to turn his back toward the people. He should face us. So I think that's also kind of a mistaken idea, because what really happens is both priests and congregation are turning themselves toward the Lord. So this kind of conversi ad dominum, there's this ancient call, conversi ad dominum, let us turn toward the Lord. And that's kind of what happens in the traditional liturgy, and when we have this ad orientem orientation, all of us kind of are turning ourselves toward the Lord. And this is again also highlighted before by Francesco. And again, just to restate, east. Why east? Because east is where the sun rises, and we, again, as part of tradition, the rising sun is considered as a symbol, a sign of the cosmos, the presence of God in the cosmos. So that's the altar. And I mentioned two very important objects in the church. So the other one, I would argue, is the tabernacle. So tabernacle is where the body of our Lord Jesus Christ himself, in the form of the Blessed Sacrament, is reserved. And if we indeed believe that that's the actual body of our Lord, then the tabernacle is what kind of validates the church as a house of God. So because it's actually the dwelling place of God, and because it's actually where God is, it's very important. And architectural speaking, traditionally there have been people have tried to highlight that. And here I'm giving an example of the tabernacle at St. Peter Basilica. You can see the design of the tabernacle here is actually kind of like a small church. You have these columns, you have a dome. And also what's interesting here is kind of the presence of statues of two angels on the side, and kind of brings to the faithful that actually even angels worship the presence of our Lord in the tabernacle. And I've seen throughout my time in the U.S., I've seen some churches where they do have this kind of angels on the side of the tabernacle, and I think that's kind of I like that kind of idea. Kind of brings the faithful to even better understanding of what is present there in the tabernacle. So that's the tabernacle. And then the altar especially, and in most cases up to the recent times again, anyway, the tabernacle are usually present, are usually placed in the sanctuary. So the sanctuary is, again, if we connect it back to the Jewish place of worship at the Temple of Solomon, it's what I would argue as the equivalent of the Holy of Holies. But given that we have the tabernacle where our Lord himself is reserved there, one main difference that we, in the Christian place of worship, we do indeed have God's presence in the church. So that's one main difference between Jewish and the Christian one. But still, both are very holy places. So let's focus on the holiness of the sanctuary. So it's basically the holiest place, I would say, in the church, the sanctuary. And because of its kind of sacred nature, then it's traditionally the designers of church see a need kind of to separate it, to show some separation between the sanctuary and the rest of the church. And there are several ways that have been implemented to do this. One is a common way, at least up to kind of the fairly recent time, is to use the altar rail. So the altar rail is where the faithful receive communion, but it's also can be seen as kind of the gate of the sanctuary. So you see that what's behind the altar rail is kind of a very holy place. So that's if you see, like, some churches in the U.S. still have altar rails, and you can see kind of that separation. And another way, especially you can see this in the older churches in Europe, is to use choir screens. So here's an example. This is a church in, I think, a small parish church in England. They still have this kind of screen separating the sanctuary from the rest of the church. And actually, the Byzantine Catholics actually are more elaborate in their way to separate the sanctuary and the rest of their church. They use the iconostasis. So iconostasis is like a choir screen, but decorated elaborately with icons. So that's what they use. And I think it's proper that for the holiest place in the church, that not anyone can enter it. So not anyone should be able to kind of enter the sanctuary. And this kind of separation highlights that fact. I have to check on this, but I think traditionally only ordained people can be in the sanctuary. But I have to do more research on that. So that's the sanctuary, and now let me just go through kind of the other parts. Now we go, let's say, from the sanctuary, we go to the body of the church, the nave. And you can consider, if you consider the church kind of like a human body, so you have the head, the sanctuary being the head, then you have the body, the nave, the body of the church, the nave. And that's where the lay people usually kind of reside during the liturgy. And still, we have, even in the body, kind of this orientation toward the head and toward the sanctuary, toward where the altar is. And then, so there's the nave, and both the nave and also the sanctuary usually are decorated with, again, iconography. So this is Michael Rose's third law, iconography. So the iconography serves as decoration, but I would say also serve more than just a decoration, because they actually can help the faithful to contemplate, to meditate the divine presence. And this is something also mentioned by two great saints. Saint Thomas Aquinas says that man's mind's raised to contemplation through material objects, so these iconographic objects. And Saint Ignatius of Loyola also emphasizes the importance of visualizing the subjects of your meditation, and these iconographic objects can help in that. And also, besides helping for contemplation, it's also kind of help to educate. The iconographic objects can help us kind of educate the truth of our faith. And a stark example is, you can see in the Sistine Chapel here. You see all, if you've been there, you see all these marvelous paintings. And if you look at the ceiling, you can actually learn about the story of the creation. And then if you see the apse, the sanctuary wall, you can see a history of the Last Judgment. So that's important for contemplation, helping the faithful contemplation, but also as kind of ways to educate the faithful, the truth of the Christian, the Catholic faith. And then now let's go outside the church and let's consider the exterior. And the exterior is also still kind of important, because I think the role of the exterior of the church should kind of highlight the divine presence that's inside it. It should be brought out by the exterior. And the exterior also kind of should serve as like a beacon, a call both for the faithful and for potentially the non-believers, also to invite them to be present in something that's divine, that's inside the church. And I think for like the traditional churches, it's kind of very easy to tell that whether a building is a church or not. And I think because as part of the design, it's kind of integral to kind of show that there's actually something divine here. It's not quite as true for some newer modern churches, I would say. And that's actually a good time to transition to the modern era. So, okay. So this is a church, actually not in the US. It's actually a church in Singapore, built in 2004. The Church of St. Mary of the Angels actually won some architectural awards. And the website of the parish used to have kind of a page on the idea behind the design of the church, and used to have also the statement of the architects designing the church. And this is a quote from the architect's statement, actually. So the Catholic Church initiated reforms to the worship spaces in a document known as Vatican II, which directed new churches to recapture the qualities of the early Christian churches. These were characterized by being in the round, a space where the whole community participated in the liturgy, rather than the later churches where rituals were performed as if on a stage. And the parishes were separated both physically and symbolically by the raised sanctuary, screens, and physical distance. Yeah, quite a number of problematic things here in the statement. First, there's no document called Vatican II. Well, there's the Second Vatican II Council. And one of the documents is indeed the Constitution of the Sacred Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium. But I don't recall this kind of directive to build new churches so that it looks like early Christian churches. And there's also this questionable statement about the fact that in the early Christian churches, they were kind of designed in the round. I don't think it has any basis at all. And also, there's this kind of attitude seeing basically the traditional design, basically the sanctuary, as I mentioned, the separation of the sanctuary, especially the separation of the sanctuary, the faithful being behind the sanctuary on the nave, it's seen by these modern architects as kind of something bad. Let's go deeper a little bit. So it's easy to think that the problems of modern Catholic Church architecture kind of started from the time of Vatican II, but actually it started even before Vatican II. It's more 20th century phenomenon in conjunction with kind of the movement in modern architecture. And this is seen, it can be seen by the example here. So this is this church. Anybody knows this church? So this church is the Saint Louis Abbey Church in the suburbs of Saint Louis. It's actually completed in 1962. And if you remember, the Vatican II Council started in 1962. So this actually was designed even before Vatican II. And using modern architectural principles, so this kind of, they like these curves. So they don't like kind of straight lines, linearity, sharp angles. And when I see this church, I'm reminded of, I don't know if anybody is familiar with the TWA terminal at JFK. So it's kind of, yeah, it looks similar. Well, yeah, the TWA terminal at JFK is considered kind of the classic, iconic example of modern architecture. And yeah, I see some resemblance here. So this, in general, as you can see from this the statement before, they claim that they have this desire to go back to the beginning, to go back to the time of the early Christians, and basically, in conjunction with that, they also consider that anything after the time of the early Christians not as good. So that's actually a form of what's called antiquarianism. And that's something that's also kind of, so Pope Pius XII actually warned against this kind of attitude, this antiquarianism attitude. So especially in his encyclical Mediator Dei, number 62, so let me read it, the relevant part. So assuredly, it is a wise and most laudable thing to return in spirit and affection to the sources of the sacred liturgy. But it is neither wise nor laudable to reduce everything to antiquity by every possible device. Thus, to cite some instances, one would be straying from the straight path were he to wish the altar restored to its primitive table form. So that's just an example. And even kind of some of their claims, as we see before, like church in the round, there's kind of no historical foundation, even if you go back to the time of the early Christian. That kind of idea is basically a modern innovation rather than something historical. So they like to think that everything that's not from the early church is bad. So they basically want to get rid of those. So they want to have a break with the continuity of tradition that has kind of occurred in the church throughout the centuries. So this is also something that Pope Benedict XVI warned about. So this kind of attitude, he called it the hermeneutic of rupture, and that's kind of I think he agrees that it's a source of many of the current problems in the church, this kind of attitude, this breaking from tradition, from continuity in tradition, especially. So that's kind of just at the high level what the attitude for modern church architecture. And let's go a little bit deeper and this is, yeah, to get here, I want to show this kind of book by Father Richard Fosco. Yeah, he's actually a priest. He's also a well-known, not in necessarily in a good sense, what's called the liturgical design consultant. So he gives advice on both kind of new church constructions, the design of new church construction, and also on the kind of designs when renovating older traditional churches. So, but the title of his book is very revealing. So, God's house is our house. So, what this kind of shows the attitude of the people who the proponents of the modern church architecture. So, one of their principles is basically to make the church as familiar as your own house. So, and they like to fashion the church as basically a meeting house where, yeah, you can meet other faithful Christians and then, yeah, celebrate Mass together. But there's this diminishing emphasis on the reality of the church as a house of God. So it's kind of, yeah, just like your own house. So if it's like that, then why go to a church at all, right? Just stay in your own house. And another kind of common suggestion, common idea is to bring the altar. First, the altar, they like even kind of to use simple tables. I think they like to emphasize simplicity in the altar. So very often you see just very simple wooden table as the altar. And they like to bring the altar to in the center of the church. And then they have the people kind of stand around the altar. And you can see that here and here. And they have this idea. They like to emphasize the fact that, yeah, God is present in the assembly. And as kind of a side effect of that, they think that there's no more, not much need anymore for the tabernacle, at least inside the main church building. So they think the tabernacle can be a distraction, and they like to move it outside of the main church building. And actually, let me read a quote from this book. So this is a pretty long quote, but yeah. So it may be helpful to note that Christ is also really present in the life of the community. We should never act as if the experience of Christ's presence is limited to the substantial presence in the sacrament. One must wonder, therefore, why the visible presence of the tabernacle is such a preoccupation for some, especially during the celebration of the Eucharist, when, in fact, the adoration of that sacrament is not at all appropriate. Perhaps more catechesis stressing the other ways in which Christ is really present would be beneficial for some congregations. It will help to begin giving due reference to the scriptures and to the assembly itself. And then, distributing the reserved sacrament weakens the sign value of giving thanks, breaking bread together, and sharing in a common meal. When this is done habitually, the value of these central actions at the very center of Catholic life is worn away. If logic were to prevail, one might deduce that the tabernacle need not be located in the same place where the Eucharist is celebrated. Quite simply, the adoration of the reserved sacrament is not a high priority for most Catholics, nor has it been in the history of the Church. So it's quite striking, I would say. And yeah, this is something actually, so this book is actually written at least, I don't know if it's written, but it's published after Pope Benedict's book, but this kind of attitude is already present. And yeah, Pope Benedict actually dismissed this claim, so let me just quote what Pope Benedict says. So he says, adoration for the presence of the Blessed Sacrament in the tabernacle. Thus, adoration is not opposed to communion, nor is it merely added to it. No, communion only reaches its true depths when it is supported and surrounded by adoration. And this is the key sentence. The Eucharistic presence in the tabernacle does not set another view of the Eucharist alongside or against the Eucharistic celebration, but simply signifies its complete fulfillment. So it's a very, I would say it's a very scary claim, the fact that tabernacle is considered as a distraction. And another one is, they like to remove separation. They like to remove especially highlighting the sanctuary. So they consider altar rails are barriers, and why not remove these barriers? So in a lot of churches today, we don't see the churches built from the older kind of traditional style. They have the altar rails removed. That's quite common. So with this kind of removal of the separation and all these kind of suggestions, one wonders then whether there's any sense of holiness, any sense of the sacred left in the church when you do this, when you implement this in the church. This is some of the fundamental kind of principles that they apply in designing new churches. So this is, you can see, so this church is actually designed, so Father Fosco helped design this church. This is Corpus Christi University Parish Church in Ohio, I think. And here, the second picture is actually in the book. So actually I have the book here with me, if you want to take a look. And you can see that they actually have, this is a mass going on, and it's kind of like, you need like a banquet. And you have the altar on the center, you have, I think there's some reading going on. And then people are just sitting around. Okay. So this they apply this for designing new churches, and they also apply this when they renovate older churches. Can you recognize this picture? That's our church of St. Stephen. Exactly. So this is a picture of actually St. Stephen Church that I found on the internet. There's no freestanding altar. When I came to Portland, I visited St. Stephen. I was looking for where's the tabernacle. There's no tabernacle in the main church building, and actually, it was put in the side chapel. And fortunately, we have the tabernacle restored. But you can see kind of implementation of these modern principles even in the St. Stephen. I don't see altar rails here, so I wonder if St. Stephen ever has altar rails. But you have basically just this main altar with the canopy in it. So another example is shown on the right. So this is the cathedral in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So this is kind of the original design. So they have this main altar with the very elaborate baldachin canopy. And under protest of a lot of the faithfuls and even the Vatican, with the help of Father Fosco, the Archdiocese decided to renovate it, or I would say recovate it. And this is how the church looks like now. So you have the original main altar is basically destroyed, and they replace it with an organ. they put the altar in the center. So this is a classic kind of example. And I think the cathedral in Seattle also was kind of renovated in this way. But yeah, you shouldn't kind of lose hope because there's been kind of a renewal in understanding for this kind of traditional principles of Catholic Church architecture. So here are two examples. So this is the chapel of Our Lady of Guadalupe Seminary in Nebraska. This is the Fraternity of St. Peter Seminary. So this is actually completed in, I believe, 2010. So it's hard to tell that, such a kind of traditional church kind of only recently built. And this is another example. So this is the chapel of Thomas Aquinas College in Santa Paula, California, near Los Angeles. So this is actually one of the churches built by Duncan Stroik. And the title slide actually shows the interior of this church. And there's also this example here. So this is a church in Brooklyn, New York. So the Holy Name of Jesus Church. So this is what the original design looks like. Very beautiful high altar. You see the altar rail. And they turn it to look like this. So from this, it looks like this. Some people call it the hockey stick church. But now there's a project going on to basically, well, not quite to restore it to the original church, but to kind of apply again the traditional principles. So this is what they plan to do in the restoration of the sanctuary. So yeah, there's some hope going forward. And yeah, I think I've just to recap, I hope I've kind of given you a little bit more understanding about the architecture. There's actually principles behind the architecture of traditional churches, and it should be kept in mind, especially when designing new churches or renovating existing one. But I think, especially if you consider, again, if you go back to the reality of a church as a house of God, again, gate of heaven, and you keep that in mind throughout the process of either building or renovating, I think you'll be pretty much on the right path. So, thank you.
Yes,